Hello, and welcome to today's Training Industry webinar, Sales Training Reimagined, Save Time, Money, and Motivate Your Sales Teams, sponsored by Imparta. I'm Leah Johnson, Market Research Manager at Training Industry, and I'm so happy you could join us today. Before we get started, I'd like to quickly go over a few housekeeping items to help you interact with our speaker and get the most out of today's program. Throughout today's event, please feel free to submit questions, and we will address them as possible toward the end of the program. We also encourage you to share the information you received today with your colleagues and network via social media. Please include the hashtag TIWebinars and the Twitter handle @Imparta so we're able to track your contribution to the conversation. When the program ends, you'll receive a short evaluation survey, and we would greatly welcome your feedback about the content, speaker, or whatever you would like to share. As always, today's webinar will be recorded and archived on trainingindustry.com, and you'll be receiving a follow-up email from us that will include a link to the on-demand program and a copy of the slide deck for you to share with your team. Finally, should you have any technical troubles today, you can send me a chat message, or you can reach out to Sister Tech Support, whose number is bolded in red on your screen. If this is your first webinar with us, a special welcome goes out to you. At Training Industry, we offer dozens of webinars each year on subjects ranging from authenticity in the workplace to microlearning, innovation to change management, workforce development, and just about every topic relevant to leaders of training organizations around the globe. If you've attended one of these programs in the past, thank you so much for joining us again. Now to get started, please let me introduce you to today's speaker, Richard Barkey. Richard founded Imparta in 1997. He was formerly at McKinsey & Company, where he spent 4 years as a management consultant, and then 3 years pioneering the use of simulation-based training. Having grown Imparta to be recognized in the global top 20 sales training companies 6 years in a row, Richard remains closely involved in learning design, as well as taking overall responsibility for the direction of the business. Richard holds an MA in engineering and an MBA with distinction from the Harvard Business School. Today, Richard will explain how to deliver against the often conflicting goals of driving sales performance, engaging learner, and reducing training costs. Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Leah, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us, especially on this momentous day. I certainly wouldn't dream of commenting on the election that's just happened, but what I would say is that I'm very glad today that I'm in the business of sales training and not in the business of forecasting election results. So Imparta, which is the company I run, just to give you a little bit of context, operates in 3 main areas that are the kind of go-to-market customer-focused parts of the organization. So sales, marketing, and customer service are our 3 primary areas. We also do quite a lot of work in the leadership arena, but primarily in support of those functional areas. And then in the center of the diagram here, you'll see something called the capability building system. So when I founded the company, my belief was that training on its own doesn't work. And you need to kind of have a lean, effective change process that wraps around the training to make it stick. So I'll talk about the capability building system as a model later on, but ultimately that's the engine that powers the content that we provide in those 3 areas. So the topic for today is how do you reimagine sales training, and as Leah said, how do you kind of save money and time and engage millennials. And I think when we think about sales training, and I suppose in many ways any training really that's face-to-face, we quite often think about a bunch of salespeople or account managers sitting in a room with a trainer or a manager, some of them not really wanting to be there, and taking a fair amount of time off the road, typically 2 or 3 days, away from trying to hit their quota, and costing a fair amount of money, both in terms of the fees paid to an external party, the cost of travel and accommodation, and of course the opportunity cost of those people being off the road. So while traditional sales training can be very effective, there are some issues that ideally we would like to address with it. The problem is when we think about e-learning as a form of sales training, there are perhaps some different but equally tricky challenges there. So we tend to think about somebody on their computer trying to do e-learning, but often being interrupted by emails or websites with election results on, or various other forms of interruption. But then the e-learning itself is kind of often a piece of theory, maybe not quite as complex as that shown there, but a piece of theory followed by a kind of multiple choice question or a quiz or some kind of exercise to test their understanding. And that's great, but it does have the issue that it may not be as effective as face-to-face training. So we did some research with Leah's organization, trainingindustry.com, that covered 235 organizations across multiple vertical markets, primarily in the US. And that research showed that 71% of organizations believe that cost savings are indeed a benefit of using e-learning as a form of sales training. About half felt that salespeople prefer e-learning to other methods, but only 30%, or about a third, believe that sales training via e-learning is very effective compared to those more traditional approaches. So here's the challenge, right? We have an approach in e-learning that potentially offers improvements in efficiency, but it's not as effective. And cost is obviously one of the things we're trying to overcome with e-learning, but there are others. So I'm going to ask, just before we move forward, for your input as a group around the current challenges that you have with sales training. So if I could ask you just to select any of these that would apply to your organization. Are you trying to align stakeholders, make the training stick, reduce cost, tailoring the content to your environment, or perhaps achieving and measuring impact? There are more one could have here, but we're limited to 5 questions on the poll. So if I could just ask you to just select any of those that apply in your organization.
If you guys haven't already done so, please take a moment and select your response or responses on the screen. I'll be closing the poll in just a moment. Give you guys a couple more seconds to select. Right, and Richard, here are your results.
Thank you. So 78% of people trying to achieve and measure impact, which is an interesting, not perhaps a surprising story there. Interesting that 57% are looking at trying to tailor the content to our environment. Not so many about reducing costs, which is interesting. Making the training stick is key. So I guess the focus of this group then is primarily on effectiveness rather than necessarily efficiency. But I suppose those two things are very closely tied together. So if I were to plot a graph, and as my colleagues know, if you spend any time at McKinsey, you end up thinking in 2x2 matrices. So if we could go back to the slides, please, Leah. Thank you. If we were to plot different approaches on a graph of effectiveness on the y-axis and cost on the x-axis, traditional e-learning is typically relatively low cost, and if we're talking about the kind of talking PowerPoint plus exercise approach, relatively ineffective. Face-to-face sales training is obviously much more expensive and much more effective if it's done well, but still leaves effectiveness and impact on the table, I think, compared to what we typically call a sales academy, by which I mean really a sales training that's multi-year and has more change elements in it. And we'll come back to what that means in a minute. And the orange line there is the value equivalence line, and I think the sales academies are kind of generally a better trade-off, in my view, between cost and effectiveness. But what we're trying to achieve with these digital sales academies is to kind of break the rules here, topical phrase, I think, and increase effectiveness for a cost that is kind of a bit more than traditional sales e-learning. So that's what I think one can do with a digital sales academy. So the rest of this webinar, I'm going to provide some kind of generalizable lessons around digital sales academies, and not make this a product pitch, but we also have just launched a product called the Virtual Sales Academy, which I'm going to use with your permission to illustrate some of the points that I'm making. And there are 4 areas that I'll cover in the next sort of half an hour or so. The first is best practices in digital sales training and how to avoid the common pitfalls that waste time and money. The second is how to empower managers and energize an increasingly millennial sales audience. The third is how you can transfer the best components of these kind of real-world sales academies into the digital domain. And finally, Cisco is an organization that we've worked with very closely at Imparta around this with their global virtual sales and customer success organization. And I'll provide a bit of information about the work we did there in a sort of mini case study, just to illustrate some of the points even further. So let's start off by talking about best practices in digital sales training, how to avoid those pitfalls, the slippery banana skins of wasting time and money. Now, many of you on this call will be aware of Kolb's learning cycle. David Kolb studied how adults learn skills and described it using a cycle that begins in the top right segment with experience. So we have some kind of new experience, maybe a simulation or an activity on the job, that creates a motivation to improve and a context for learning. We then reflect on how well we did in that experience, and then we move into a stage that Kolb called abstract conceptualization, which basically means trying to build a mental model of how the world works, how you apply skills in this particular context. And that's where kind of theory can be brought in to help explain the experience that people have had. And then finally we get into the experimentation phase where people are adapting their new approach to different scenarios and trying to incorporate these new approaches into their day-to-day life. So to take a very simple example, if I have an experience of sticking my finger in a candle flame, I might reflect on that and say, well, that hurt. And abstract conceptualization could be bright things are hot, or it could be flames are hot, and I can get these wrong, of course. And experimentation might be trying my finger on various things of different brightness and different flame-like nature and seeing what happens. Not that I would do that, but that's the kind of process that we go through to build a skill. So the problem is that most e-learning doesn't actually follow that cycle at all. And if you think about the kind of typical e-learning that you would see, we often begin, perhaps arguably rightly, by explaining learning objectives and then showing theory. And then we ask people quiz questions and get them to reflect on their answers. And there are a couple of problems with this. One is it's going backwards around the cycle. You're starting with the theory, not with experience, and you're then moving from theory back into reflection, which doesn't necessarily fit with the way we build skills. And the second is that we often are missing the experience part, and unless you're applying this for those of you who are aware of 70-20-10, that kind of an environment, we're not doing experimentation either. And beyond that, we also tend to have e-learning that's one size fits all. It's fire and forget in the sense of it's learning that people are given, but there's very little follow-up, and often there's little or no manager involvement as well. So that's why e-learning typically is very good at knowledge transfer, but not brilliant at building skill, because it doesn't follow the kind of accepted learning theory around how adults build skills. So what can we do to improve our performance against that? And I think there are a number of things we can do using various kind of self-created or off-the-shelf tools, and the kind of tools like Articulate and so on are getting much better these days at enabling, if you know what you're doing, these kinds of approaches. So in the experience kind of segment, we can provide simulations, we can do virtual case studies, or even use real-world situations, and perhaps in a digital but still synchronous format with a coach or a manager providing, guiding people through that experience. Similarly, in that kind of format, we can use online coaching or feedback from managers, or if you're doing a simulation, feedback built into the simulation to encourage the reflection. And whether it's through a learning management system or some kind of corporate chat function, or even just a simple kind of WhatsApp type situation, you can encourage peer-to-peer group discussions for that reflection piece. Abstract conceptualization, this is where I think more typical traditional sales e-learning can be helpful, especially if it's adaptive. In other words, you don't make everybody go through the same thing, but you tailor the content they're going through based on what they need, based on step 2. And in the sales arena in particular, ideally this is marrying the sales skills with your particular product or service details. So not just how do I sell, but how do I sell my product or service. And then finally, in the experimentation phase, we can create opportunities to do virtual group work on the job activities, or perhaps curate role plays where the manager plays an active role in role-playing with their team members to make sure they've got the skills and to build their confidence in coaching. At the bottom of this slide, we talk about kind of, ideally all of this is modular, so that the content is broken up into bite-sized pieces and wrapped, as I said before, in a simple change process. So at a very kind of abstract level, that's the kind of suggestions I would offer as ways to make e-learning and a blended approach to learning fit better with the way people learn skills. Now, when we built the Virtual Sales Academy, what I did was I basically took my team and a few clients and various other people, and we disappeared into a darkened room for a few weeks and went, if we were trying to build the best e-learning in the world, an e-learning that genuinely followed this kind of approach, what would it look like? And it's not often actually in one's career that one has the opportunity to really step back and take a kind of greenfield approach to things like this. So I was very excited, and I am very excited about what we've done. So the experience in the Virtual Sales Academy, we use simulations, which is something I've been doing for 20 years or so now, but kind of bite-sized simulations to provide that experience in a sales scenario, which can be tailored to a particular organization or generic. Then we use feedback on how people have done in the simulation to encourage them to reflect on particular skills they've used, what they've done well and what they've done poorly. And we bring in other things to encourage that reflection process. For example, videos of what we call voice of the customer, where real customers or actors are describing the impact of good and bad performance of these skills on their perception and their behavior. Then we move into the abstract conceptualization piece, and this is where we provide the theory, and that is done in an adaptive way. So it looks at what people have been good at in the experience part and feeds them the theory that they need to improve most of all. And that theory has in it little exercises to consolidate understanding. And then finally, they get to try again in a take 2 of the simulation where they experiment and try different approaches and make sure they've really understood it. Then at the end of the module, they're given tools to help them do that in the real world, and typically an on-the-job activity that they need to report back to their manager with. So that's, if you like, the structure of one module inside the Virtual Sales Academy. And I think gives you an approach, an idea of the kind of way you can build this Kolb approach to learning into a real-life e-learning product. Now, that's just one module, and that might take, let's say, 45 minutes or an hour to go through. That is embedded in turn in a curriculum that can be tailored and look something like this. And this is the original Cisco one. It goes from an engaged session where the there's kind of videos of the leader of that organization, a personal assessment where people go through a relatively straightforward quiz process or a competency assessment to identify where their strengths and weaknesses are and where they need to focus, which modules they need to focus on. The system sets up a personal learning plan and a coaching session with the manager. And then we go through various kind of modules that cover things like introduction to consultative selling, interpersonal skills, building awareness of needs, and so on. And at the end of each section, there's a gate where there's a role play with the manager, and that is set up by the system that provides a briefing to both the manager and the participant, and the manager provides feedback on their competencies directly into the system. So an example, but a way that you can kind of use that learning system within each of these modules and put it in a journey that makes sense for somebody to go through. This was an induction program, but could equally be in a general sales improvement process. Just again, I'm conscious I'm kind of talking about Imparta specific stuff here, but just to talk about in the sales context, the kind of content that one might want to consider including. And we think about content in a core sales curriculum in 5 different levels: foundation, core, extension, manager, and leader. So the foundation level, you have kind of core consultative selling skills like rapport building, questioning, and so on. At the creating client value level, that's the kind of opportunity management piece. And then you might have extension skills like negotiation, commercial acumen, strategic account management, and then sales coaching and sales management, and finally sales leadership. And each of those courses, if you like, is broken up into typically 8 or 10 modules that we represent with these playing cards. And so you can pick and choose, and you may well in your own content management system have a way of doing that too, where you can pick and choose which modules a particular role or a particular group of people need to be going through. So let's talk about how to empower managers and energize an increasingly millennial sales audience. Because if you like, that's the structure, but how does it actually work in practice for getting people fizzed up and wanting to do this stuff? Managers, as we all know, are critical in any training or change process, and I think especially in e-learning it's quite easy not to empower managers. So you know, if you go to a manager, we're training your people, don't worry, you don't really have to be involved because we're doing it centrally. We'll give you some data on who's done what so that you can chase them up if they haven't done it. Thanks for your input, but we don't need it because actually it's not tailored and everybody gets the same thing. So that's the kind of approach how not to empower managers. The flip side of that, I think, is if we look at how to empower managers, if you can give a manager or your group of managers, and again, much of this will be stating the obvious to you, but a briefing on the process and the payoff for the training that's to happen, ideally a short version of what the team is going to be going through so that they are not left in the dark and they have you know, enough knowledge to feel comfortable talking to the team about what they're doing while respecting their time constraints. Data on how people have done in the assessment and a structure for doing that kind of personal development planning with each team member. Perhaps a refresher on coaching skills if it's been a while since that manager has done that, or perhaps, dare I say, if they haven't had coaching training. Some kind of structured involvement with the trainee through assessments or role plays and on-the-job activities that individual is going to be doing and feeding back to the manager for further coaching. Now, in a traditional sales academy, some of that is quite hard work, if I'm honest. There's a lot of fairly manual processes that need to be completed to make all of that happen. The interesting thing from my point of view in a digital sales academy is that much of this can be automated so that you know, if one is trying to become more efficient, especially in an uncertain world as we're facing, that kind of automation makes sure that you're consistent in the way that managers are dealt with and deal with their teams, but it also saves cost. So turning from the managers to the individuals, and many of our sales teams that we work with are increasingly millennial. So I think it's interesting just to step back and look at some of the characteristics of a millennial audience and ask how, not just the Virtual Sales Academy, but how any kind of e-learning or training intervention can be designed to gel nicely with that kind of audience. So millennials, as we know, like visuals. They like to visualize things. And again, most e-learning will do this, but including not just words, but diagrams and tools, and not using the diagrams as window dressing to make something look pretty, but actually using it to add understanding and add substance to the message that's being given. Millennials like to play, so that can be at a very simple level, gamification, where you kind of we have a leaderboard where you can see how you're doing on a particular module against everybody else. But it's not just about that, it's also about making things interactive, the kinesthetic approach to learning, if you like, and making it new and making it fun. And so there are lots of tools that we can all use to make sure that happens. Millennials tend to be seen as free birds. They don't necessarily like to be kind of constrained and forced to go through a rigid process. So making learning for millennials as self-guided as possible will help. That doesn't mean there can't be any structure, so you can give people an assessment and use that assessment to help them to drive their own learning at their own pace. Out with the plans, millennials tend to be switching input streams once every 3 minutes is the statistic that I saw, and they're not great at planning long term. They tend to be kind of living more in the moment. So providing flexibility in the way that people access the content, and most LMSs and learning content nowadays is stuff that you can access in various formats and on various platforms, whether it's mobile or laptop or whatever. But for example, providing PDFs for people who want to read things, maybe even a podcast for people who'd rather listen to it. There are different structures that we can, or different formats that we can offer. Last two things, millennials like clarity on what they're doing, where they're doing it, when, and indeed why they're doing it. So the context is very important. So explaining the context of the learning and the payoff early and often is critical. And finally, they are generation coached. They're very, very avid consumers of coaching, which means that the more opportunities we have to provide coaching, the better, whether that's virtual or real coaching from actual people, and that might be managers or external experts. But managers, as we said before, are critical to this process. So the penultimate section, we're just going to talk quickly about the best components of real-world sales academies and how we transfer those into the digital domain. So, Leah, sorry, could you just go back to the slide one very quickly for me?
Unfortunately, I launched the poll already, so I can't quite go back.
Oh, I can't. Okay, all right, not to worry, no problem at all. Okay, so the question here is, for those of you who do sales training, or it doesn't have to be sales training, this really is, I suppose, more generally applicable. I'm curious to understand what academy elements or what elements of change tools beyond the training itself do you use? And again, this isn't a comprehensive list, but if I could ask you to have a think about this and respond, it would be great.
If you guys haven't already done so, you can select your responses by clicking on your screen. I'll give you guys just a few more moments to select your responses. Looking like we have a clear winner. All right, and Richard, here are your results.
Thank you very much. So manager coaching, pleasingly, and not surprisingly, is something that pretty much everybody does. Application tools next in line, and that's great because obviously the more people are encouraged to use skills in their day-to-day workflow, the better. I'm pleased to see also 50% roughly of people doing application sessions or deal clinics. There's nothing quite like helping people to see the application of these skills in a real environment to make it stick, and I'll actually come back and talk about that in a little bit later. Slightly fewer people doing measurement, and fewer still doing campaigns around strategic objectives. Now, we all understand that manager coaching is kind of one of the key enablers here, but there are other things that you can do. And I mentioned, if we go back to the slides, the capability building systems. There's a poll that you can't answer, but I was wondering if anybody knows what that statue is. And it's actually the statue of Socrates in the Academy of Athens, which is a tenuous link, perhaps, but it was quite fun. So the capability building system I talked about right at the top of this session is a model, and there are many, I understand that, but it's a model of thinking about what things you can do to structure change process around the training that you do. It begins with connect at the top, which is about creating a vision of where you're trying to get to and connecting the people to be trained to that vision. Then engaging them in the change, and that's where gamification and planning the learning with managers comes in. Developers develop skills. So develop skills through, as we've said, experiential learning and manager role plays and other approaches. And then stick. And stick is, if we go back to the question we asked earlier, one of the areas that most people struggle with. Manager coaching is clearly a big part of that. On-the-job activities is part of stick. Embedded tools is part of that. Digital reinforcement and so on. And then measure, which I've just put up in the top right-hand corner, at the 4 Kirkpatrick levels, measuring kind of how much people liked it, whether they understood it, are they applying it, and what's the impact been, and have they understood it, I would kind of treat as knowledge, and then are they applying it as skill. So measuring the impact of training, as we know, tends to draw people through the application process, and celebrating success is just psychologically a very positive thing to do. So that's a kind of general model that may be helpful if you don't have one already for what kind of the change elements of a sales academy might look like. Just to talk about how these can be digitized, and again, I'm using the example of the Virtual Sales Academy, but you could achieve similar goals perhaps with other tools as well. So creating a vision and connecting people to it is largely about communication, although we are actually currently working on a system that uses the Virtual Sales Academy to interrogate or to kind of ask people questions about the vision for where we're trying to take a sales organization, and using tools like Net Promoter Score tries to assess change readiness across the organization and provide you as an L&D professional or as a sales leader with a map of where the kind of skill and will sits within the organization at the moment. That's quite interesting. Engage, we have assessments and so on that allow the beginning of the engagement with the learning journey and to kind of set a benchmark. We also use gamification. You can see on that little diagram, the bottom middle, the leaderboard rather, and the learning plan that happens with managers. Develop, we've talked about already, so experiential learning, and the little iPad thing there is the manager role play that's fed to the manager and to the participant. And then finally making it stick with things like, you can see on the left there a CRM tool, or it could be even something as simple as PowerPoint tools or Excel tools that people can use in their day-to-day job. And then finally measure knowledge, skill and impact. What you see there is a radar plot of a fairly complex competency model that one client has, and you can see a mixture of different inputs there from their own self-assessment, a 180-degree assessment with their manager, the results of the role plays and the results of simulations they've done. So you can get a pretty good read on where somebody's strengths and weaknesses are. So all of those elements of a Virtual Sales Academy can be delivered in a digital way that again increases efficiency and consistency while at the same time reducing cost, which as the CEO of a business I quite like. A couple of final things just to say about this aspect, and something's gone wrong with the diagram here, but basically what this is a way of looking at the same content. So there's a module in the center here that might have additional content or socially generated content wrapped around it. And there are 4 ways of accessing that content that I think is interesting to consider, because as L&D people we tend to think about running a course, which is the one at the top, and unfortunately somehow in the translation to Citrix we've lost the diagram here, but I'll tell you what it says, which at the top is simply course, and that's the most traditional approach. It might be we're running training for all account managers or all salespeople on a particular skill set. Going round the clock, on the right-hand side it should say competency, and this is where you don't necessarily want to sheep dip everybody in a particular course, but you may have a desire for different people to build different skills. So you can go back to the radar plot in the Virtual Sales Academy and click through a competency where you're not doing particularly well and be given learning material, course modules, additional content to help people improve in that area. So that might be developing people in an existing role or perhaps preparing them from for a transition to a new role. At the bottom it should say context, and that is really it's kind of just-in-time training around a work task. So I'm trying to plan a segment or an account, I'm trying to win a deal, and that's where you can access the content, but it's there as kind of context-sensitive help around a particular task. And then finally on the left-hand side it should say campaign, 4 Cs, and the campaign is either an internal issue, like we're trying to improve our win rate or launch a new product, or it might be something that's driven externally. For example, we have a competitor that's entered a market and we want to beat them. And so there you're providing training that's stimulated by the need to achieve this strategic goal. And the way that we deal with that inside the Virtual Academy is slightly different and involves some things we have already and one thing we're working on. The things we have already are the ability to kind of serve up a module of content that's particularly focused on that strategic issue. And the thing we're working on is collecting the feedback and using it to push out buzz emails that get people excited about the potential for improving and have very specific measurements against the goals of that strategic objective. So multiple ways to access the content I think is great for leveraging what you have in your kind of library of insight. And the last thing on this is that face-to-face, I believe, still has a really big role to play, and this is kind of building on the poll question that a lot of you answered about, which is the kind of deal coaching and application sessions. So my head of sales came up with an analogy for this, which is taken from the world of martial arts, and it's the kata bunkai model. So in martial arts, kata is where you kind of practice your moves in a very set way, and bunkai is where you then apply those kind of karate chops in a kind of real-life-ish setting where it's kind of free-form and you're just using the skills to see how well you apply them. In the context of learning, and in particular in the context of sales training, the kata, therefore, is doing the e-learning, and the bunkai is getting together with either peers or a manager or an Imparta expert or an external coach, or whatever it might be, to take people through the process of applying those skills in a real-world situation. And that combination is really powerful. I've seen organizations win, hundreds of millions of dollars, literally hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue, and by putting accounts and opportunities through this kind of process and just getting people to think more rigorously about the way that you can structure a pitch or uncover a need, etc. So I don't think that, so even in the context of digital sales academies, I don't think that face-to-face learning is by any means dead. It just means that it's focused on driving results and on achieving impact rather than an application rather than doing the theory. So the last section is really just talking about Cisco and how they kind of worked with us to reimagine their sales training for the global virtual sales and customer success organization. We had a session recently with Cisco where they stood up and took an audience through this, but with their permission I'm going to take you through a couple of their slides. So there are a number of applications, I think, for any form of digital sales academy, and this is how we see the application for our virtual sales academy. The first is simply establishing a common sales approach. The second is kind of extending an existing sales academy and either adding new modules of content or new reinforcement approaches to make it better and more effective. The third is reducing the cost of sales training. A fourth example is creating a best-in-class sales induction program. And those two reasons there that I've highlighted are the ones that drove Cisco's involvement with us on this. You can also use it through the competency model for developing precision development of existing teams, and because of the lower cost approach from this, you can use it to reach new audiences, maybe support staff or channel partners or geographically dispersed teams at a much lower cost than the face-to-face training. But again, Cisco were focused primarily on improving their sales induction program and reducing the cost of sales training. So they had an existing induction program. They were hiring into the GVS&CS team around about 300 people a year, so a relatively big team with a lot of new people coming in, almost all of whom were millennials. And they had an existing program that was largely delivered over WebEx by contract trainers. It was expensive as a solution. It was logistically challenging. The audience is distributed around the world, so the WebEx was often delivered at very antisocial times. It was hard to keep the content up to date. The organization was very fast growing and millennials, as I said, so the kind of WebEx and slide approach didn't really appeal very much. And having sat through some to do the kind of needs analysis, I can say myself it was pretty hard stay concentrated for the periods that were required. Cisco also have this employee promise, which is changing the way we live, work, play, and learn. And they felt that the current approach they had to induction, and now it's being rolled out to other forms of sales training, but around the induction especially, was not, that value was not being reflected in the way they did induction training at that point. So what did they want? What would success look like? And I think the first thing is they wanted something that was modern and agile, hence the cheetah. They wanted content that linked how to sell, what to sell, and where to sell. So by what, I mean obviously the product, and by where, I mean because Cisco has a very complex channel structure where they're selling both to, through, and indeed with their channel partners. They wanted that covered. And the clock on the right-hand side indicates that they were extremely keen to see new hires being brought up to speed quickly. The quicker you get a new hire to hit the ground running, the better the ROI and the better the impact on the P&L in that first year. And also, as a leading company in the digital economy, Cisco wanted something that felt state-of-the-art and modern. They looked for a solution, realized there wasn't one. I went through a pretty long RFP process. I think there were about 14 or 15 companies they approached, and I was very proud that they chose to work with us. So I think when we worked with Cisco, the things that they particularly liked in terms of the solution and what they were aiming to achieve, one was, and I apologize, we've got a rather number of circular models in this presentation, but the buying cycle on the left-hand side there is kind of a customer-centric approach to selling, and I think there are a number of sales methodologies in the world. Most of the modern ones are like this. They basically focus on how you understand the decision process that the customer is going through and how you add value to and kind of add insight to and help to move along that kind of process, beginning with the customer becoming aware of their needs, assessing their alternatives, looking at risks, making a decision and achieving the results. So having that kind of customer centricity at the heart of the content, which is there in our content, was very key. They also wanted a way to teach people about how to sell Cisco products and how to sell at the same time. So the simulations, and you can see some examples there, and they're 3D rendered moving characters using the Unity platform. Those actually do allow people to kind of practice not only selling, but practice selling Cisco products, so we can create tailored versions of those simulations as needed. And then the third thing, and I've talked about this already, is engaging the managers. And one of the, I have to say, probably quite unexpected benefits of the role play that happens at the end of each section, where we wanted the manager to observe participants and give them feedback and score them on the competencies. We knew that would be good for the participants, but what I don't think, if I'm honest, I really anticipated was how good it was for the manager, because it gave them a structured way to be involved with their teams and made them a lot more confident in coaching and you know, having development conversations with both in new hires and existing people. Results and impact. They have saved more than $1 million over 3 years. So we've been going about 1.5 years, but that's the projected saving over 3 years. And a lot is because they've cut out trainers and travel. And I think originally the plan was to reduce cost. They ended up feeling that they were getting both lower cost and better quality and consistency versus the traditional approach. They believe that there's an improvement in competitive advantage. So new hires are getting to their first sales quicker and with more confidence. You know, managers are saying things like people are actually coming in through the door because they're doing some of the induction training before people arrive. People are coming in the door ready to sell, which is a real impact. And they've linked sales training to product training. And there's a big impact on staff motivation as well. So a really big buzz for millennials compared to the traditional approach. And as I've said, managers feeling both empowered and connected to their teams in a way that perhaps they weren't before. So that is everything that I was going to talk about today. We've covered a fair range of things, from talking about how you avoid the pitfalls of traditional e-learning, how you appeal to managers and millennials, how you take the best aspects of traditional sales academies and put them into the digital world, and then touch briefly on Cisco's experience, which I'm sure they'd be happy to talk to you about if you would like to discuss that in any more detail. So I believe we have about 15 minutes left. I'm not going to talk for the next 15 minutes, but I will be delighted to answer any questions if there are any.
Absolutely, Richard. We've got some ready for you. Our first question is from John. He wants to know, how do you measure the impact of digital training, and how does this differ from traditional training?
How do you measure the impact of digital training? So that's a great question. Thanks, John. As many of the people on this call will be aware, there is a fairly established model I've referred to called Kirkpatrick's 4 levels, or 5 if you like, of training. So of training impact. That begins with measuring, did people like it? Then you use kind of quizzes and knowledge tests to test whether people have understood what's being taught. Some kind of competency measurement to test whether people are applying it, and then finally, ideally, a measure of business impact. So is it having an impact on their time to first revenue, or their performance against quota, etc. I think, in principle, the way that you measure impact in the digital domain is actually very similar to what you would do in the kind of face-to-face domain. The difference is that, again, because it's all done in the same place and using the same tool, that measurement is a lot easier and a lot more consistent in the way it's applied. So you can use the system to send out a questionnaire about how people have applied the skills, and attributing the new skills to any improvement in account or opportunity performance. So you can get even level 4 measures or return on investment measures pretty easily compared to the old way of doing it. I hope that answers the question.
Great, thank you, Richard. Our next question is from Vera. She wants to know, how long does it take for a new hire to complete this sales training program, for instance, the way it is structured in this example?
Sure, thank you, Vera. So there's about, and it depends what you want people to go through, the full suite of content that we've so far put into the format is about 50 modules, 50 hours worth of content. With Cisco, there was another 30 hours of content that was about their product suite, so that people understood the fundamentals of routers and switches, but also how to sell those things and what needs to look for, how people choose between Cisco and HP, etc., etc. So I would say somewhere between, not everybody has to do everything, so somewhere between 30 and, at the maximum, 80 hours of elapsed training, which, in terms of elapsed time, might take people a couple of weeks to do, or maybe a month to do if they want to spread it out. The thing is, you don't have to do it all in one go. The journey is there, and people are given that kind of roadmap visual as they work through stuff, so that they know where they are. And that's quite a lot of content, and I think it's testament to, if I'm not blowing my own trumpet too much to say it, but it's testament to the fact that it is gamified, it is simulation-based, that people have loved doing it, and the completion rates have been extremely, they're basically 100%, because they've found the content, because it adapts to their skill, it's relevant, and because it's simulation-based, it's engaging. So although there's a lot of content covered there, everything from basic sales skills to quite sophisticated opportunity management to kind of core negotiation skills, people have gone through that without a great deal of resistance.
Great, thanks, Richard. Our next question is from Suzanne. She says, salespeople often believe they don't need any training. How do you get them to change their mindset so they are ready to be trained online?
That's a good question as well. So if I go back to the change process, the capability building system that I mentioned, the first stage of that is connecting and engaging people with the vision for what the training is trying to achieve. Now, for induction training, that's fairly easy. We want you to come on board and be able to hit the ground running. For an existing sales team, that can require a bit more hand-holding to get people to understand the motivation for the change or for the improvement in skill, and the kind of process and payoff from doing that. So I think using some very simple visioning techniques where you basically kind of either in a workshop or through communications get people to understand that is the first thing. But the second thing, as I just alluded to, is that millennials especially want to see a payoff from the learning very quickly. So if they get early payoff, and if they see, I'm doing a simulation, or I'm doing an exercise or a role play in a workshop, whatever it may be, and do too well, you give me some help, and then I do much better the second time, and then I apply that in a real client situation. That kind of feedback process is immensely empowering for people, and that is, in my experience, what provides motivation. It's people seeing that this actually helps me rather than it's something I have to do. And that's why the kind of theory first, then quiz questions approach doesn't work so well in my mind, because it doesn't get people, it's not goal driven, right? If you give people a goal, which is achieve this outcome in the simulation, and we will provide you with the theory to help you achieve that goal, that's a far more powerful motivation to learn.
Great, thank you. Our next question is from David. He wants to know, what do you think digital sales training will look like in the next 10 years?
Oh, goodness. Well, we are currently looking, so at the moment, the simulation technology we have is kind of 2D, if you like. It's a 3D simulation you're in, but you're looking at it on the screen. We're exploring right now the use of virtual reality as a way of increasing the level of immersion and therefore emotional connection with the learning, and I think that's a very interesting area. VR overall, I think, is going to be affecting our lives quite a bit in the next couple of decades. But beyond that, I think, we've seen a gradual move away from classrooms, which I still, we do a lot of classroom sessions every year. They still have lots of value. But over the last couple of decades, I've seen an inexorable push to supplement classroom work with what's happening in the field. So I would expect to see more and more learning being democratized, being peer-based, and happening in the field as much as it is in the classroom. So the kind of 4 ways to access the content I talked about earlier, the course, competency-based, contextual, and campaign-based, is an example of that, where we're kind of trying to find ways to make learning support everybody's day-to-day lives and become a natural part of that rather than being something that's done to them. So I think I wouldn't like to predict exactly what it's going to be like in 10 years, but that's the direction of travel, I think.
Great, thanks, Richard. I think we have time for another question or two. Our next question is from Kate. She wants to know, how is the ongoing training performed, and how often should the recertification take place?
Great question. So if I understand the question, is how often, or how has it performed, right? So, I mean, at all 4 Kirkpatrick levels, and we're just doing the return on investment calculations at the moment, but the learning impact of the training in this kind of a format that follows the Kolb cycle has been dramatic and very significant. So we have a great big file full of anecdotal data about things that people have been able to achieve with clients and opening up opportunities and improving their win rate. And also the competency data shows it's a bit hard to do that for the inductees because you don't know what they were like before, but for the people who've already had competency assessments pre the training and post, there's been a good improvement. So I would say that, and I probably would say this, but it's performed very well. In terms of how often you should reapply the training, I guess that's where the campaign thing comes in for me, because there is a half-life of skill. You know, you do training and it gradually fades away unless the manager is involved and is, through the coaching they do, through the questions they ask, is keeping the skill alive. But even when the manager is doing that, I would say, you know, a kind of half-life of a year or so is probably typical. So some kind of formal reinforcement every 9 to 12 months is good practice. But at the same time, what we find it works well is to kind of do a more comprehensive program at the beginning and then deep dive on specific skills. So let's say, you know, you want to improve the skill levels of the whole sales team. You might do that initially, and then there's a particular focus on improving conversion rate or win rate in competitive pitches, to pick an example. We've actually done this where one organization was winning 1 in 10 pitches. The sales training improved, doubled that performance, but we wanted to get it further. So we did a campaign that was over the course of 3 months. People came in and we kind of measured how they were doing, did really deep dive activities around that particular skill set, coached people, measured what happened, fed it back to get the buzz going, and you can get up to kind of 50% or above win rates using that approach. So, I think, sorry, long answer to a question, but I think annually, if it's, or 18 months cycle, if it's just reinforcing what's there, but much better to take kind of once a quarter or once every 6 months deep dive into specific skills that allow you to go beyond what the initial training was able to do.
Great, thank you, Richard. Unfortunately, we are all out of time. Just a few closing words from me. I'd love for you all to join us for some upcoming training industry webinars. To visit those in our archives, please visit trainingindustry.com and select the webinars tab. We'd also love for you to get more involved with training industry. You can become a certified professional in training management. We have several practicums coming up. We have 2 virtual sessions, one in December, one in February, and we'll be in Los Angeles in February as well. All of our webinars are pre-qualified for a credit hour for CPTM recertification and a credit hour by ISPI. We'd also love to have you all join us for our Training Industry Conference and Expo in April 2017 in Raleigh, North Carolina. And on behalf of Training Industry, I'd love to thank our speaker today, Richard Barkey, and our sponsor, Imparta. If you guys have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to me at ljohnson@trainingindustry.com. Thank you so much for your time and attention today. I hope you have a great rest of your day.